I'm Peter Symbolic, the president of Ohio Dominican University. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to our campus tonight for this public lecture. I wish to extend a special welcome to our guest, Mr. John Allen Jr. It is especially an honor to have Mr. Allen return to Ohio Dominican to speak on the topic, the future church, during ODU's centennial year, celebrated with the theme of Century of Transforming Lives. As an integral part of the Catholic Church in Central Ohio, Ohio Dominican is called to promote the intellectual life of the church and to train leaders for tomorrow. With John Allen tonight, we have an opportunity to look at our self-understanding as church and to think about how the church might best respond to the opportunities and yes, threats facing our world today, so that we might forge the best future for ourselves as a Christian community. I wish now to introduce Sister Catherine Colby, Vice President for Mission Independence and the Director of the Center for Dominican Studies, who will introduce John Allen. Sister?
Good evening, everyone. So good to have you here. John, indeed, it is a pleasure to welcome you to this special event and back to Ohio Dominican University for John's third visit in 8 years. So he knows us quite well by now. John, it has been a pleasure because for each visit, you have helped us to understand better many things about church life that we didn't understand before, or we thought we did, or we learned something new. So I hope that that indeed will happen tonight. John is the senior correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter, and he serves as senior Vatican analyst for CNN. He traveled with Pope Benedict XVI on his trip to the United States. And in the summer of 2006, he established a new office in New York that allowed him to expand his coverage of both the American church and the global Catholic scene, while continuing to keep his eye on Rome. His weekly internet column, formerly The Word from Rome, and now rechristened as All Things Catholic, has a wide international relationship. He speaks widely on Catholic affairs in the United States and around the world. A graduate of the University of Kansas, Mr. Allen holds a master's degree in religious studies. He is widely considered the best source of insight into Vatican affairs and the English language. Mr. Allen's work has been widely published. He is the author of several books, including The Future Church, Pope Benedict XVI, a biography of Joseph Ratzinger, All the Pope's Men, the inside story of how the Vatican really thinks, Opus Dei, an objective look behind the myths and reality of whatever. Most controversial force in the Catholic Church, his book, The Future Church, How 10 Trends Are Revolutionizing the Catholic Church, provides an interesting and challenging read on where the Catholic Church is headed and how it might look 100 years from now. Most recently published is the book entitled A People of Hope, Archbishop Timothy Dolan in conversation with John Allen. Join me in welcoming John, who will lead us in an enlivening and thought-provoking lecture entitled The Future Church. John.
Thank you, Sister Catherine. You mentioned the fact that I've now been at Ohio Dominican 3 times as if it's somehow remarkable. But those of you who know the reality of Ohio Dominican will, I'm sure, join me in acknowledging one ineluctable truth about this place, which is it is extremely difficult to say no to Sister Catherine. So whenever you call Sister, I'm here. That's how it works. I'm delighted to be here again tonight, and in fact, I'm so humbled by the honor that Ohio Dominican is doing me by having me once again that I feel compelled to begin with a confession. Which is, there's a bit of gloss about the introduction you just heard that you ought to know. I mean, yes, it is true that I am CNN's senior Vatican analyst, but before anyone here gets terribly impressed by that, the other thing you should know is that I am also CNN's only Vatican analyst. So I'm senior in a universe of one. This is what network television does. Rather than giving you more money, they give you loftier titles. Those of you who are students, I'm sorry to tell you, this is how most professions work, so, get ready for it. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here tonight to discuss no less sweeping, no less prodigious, no less mammoth a subject than the future of the Roman Catholic Church in the 21st century. And to set the table for that conversation, I would like to begin with a parable. As you know, Jesus always began his public teaching with a parable. What better example is there than that? So here's my parable. It concerns a guy who is roughly my stage of life. That is, he's in his mid-40s. And he's going through that absolutely classic midlife crisis. And so the particular way he decides to resolve this crisis is he's going to physically rejuvenate himself. So, he goes to a gym. He takes out a membership. He's pumping iron. He becomes buff and trim. He seeks out the best plastic surgeon in town, and he has the works, facelift, tummy tuck, the whole deal. And at the end of it, he is feeling great about the results, and he wants to strut his stuff. So, the guy goes to a local Barnes & Noble, picks out a couple of, extreme sports, Gen Y-oriented magazines, and he goes to the counter to pay for them, and he asks the clerk, "Listen, would you mind humoring me? Would you just tell me how old you think I am?" So the clerk looks him up and down and says, "I don't know, I'm going to say late 20s, early 30s, something like that." The guy says, "I'm actually 47. And of course the clerk is blown away, saying, "Yeah, it's incredible, you look great, what's your secret?" So now the guy is feeling great, and he wants to do it again. So he leaves the Barnes & Noble, and he goes next door to the McDonald's. Now, it's lunch rush at the McDonald's, so he has to wait his turn in line, and finally he gets to the counter, orders his, his Happy Meal, and then when he's paying for it, he says to the person taking his money, "By the way, would you mind telling me how old you think I am?" So again, this person looks him up and down and says, "I don't know, 31, 32, for sure no older than 35. The guy says, "I'm actually 47 years old." And again, the clerk is blown away, saying, "Oh my God, that's incredible, what's your secret? My God, I hope I look that good when I'm your age." So now the guy is on cloud 9, right? And he wants one last jolt of affirmation. So, he leaves the McDonald's. He walks around the block a couple times. Finally, at the end of the block, he comes upon some people clustered around a bus stop. He walks up to one elderly woman and he says, "Excuse me, ma'am, sorry to disturb you, but would you mind humoring me? Would you just tell me how old you think I am?" And the woman says, "Well, I tell you what, if you take off all of your clothes, run around in a circle, and bark like a dog, I'll be able to tell you how old you are." Now the guy thinks this is a little weird, right? But he's determined to know if he can beat the system, and so he does it. He strips naked. He's baying at the moon. People, of course, are going nuts. This being the 21st century, they're texting the cops, not calling them, but nevertheless, it's happening. And finally, just as things are on the brink of complete chaos, he stops. And he looks the woman in the eye and he says, "All right, how old are you?" And she said, "Well, I'll tell you. You're 47 years old." Okay, now the guy is obviously flabbergasted. He says, "No, that's impossible. I have to know. How do you do it? How does it work?" She said, "I'll tell you how it works. I was behind you in line at the McDonald's." Moral of the story, ladies and gentlemen, the teaching point of the parable is this. Beware of anyone who stands before you claiming to possess esoteric means of revealing the essentially unknown. Because if you take them too seriously, you are going to end up naked, running around in a circle and barking like a dog. Okay, now the truth of it is, I don't study tea leaves, I don't cast horoscopes, I have no better claim than anyone else in this room, really, to knowing the future of the Catholic Church in the 21st century. The future, in many ways, always exceeds our grasp. But nevertheless, and this is the first bit of table setting I want to do with you, I want to suggest that this effort to look down the line at what might be coming is justified, not so much because of what it tells us about tomorrow, but rather what it tells us about today. I mean, it invites us to put on a particular pair of glasses, to try to look past isolated events and random news headlines and try to get our hands around those forces that truly are most fundamental, most primal, most pregnant with consequence, if you like, in terms of shaping the Catholic future. And that's what we're going to do here tonight, through the guise of a project that I worked on for about 3 years prior to publication, and it has now been in print for a couple of years. And it's my book, The Future Church. There we go, sorry. This is an effort to identify 10 of those primal, fundamental forces that truly are, in my judgment, at work in the Catholic Church of today, cutting through the Church and carrying it towards its tomorrow. Now, in the interest of time, what you see here is the full list of 10 trends. In the interest of time here tonight, we're probably going to be able to touch upon only about 3 or 4. The obvious corollary to that, folks, is if you want the skinny on the other trends, you really have no choice. You're just going to have to buy the book. And look, the holiday season is right around the corner. I promise you, this is the perfect stocking stuffer for that special Catholic in your life. So bit of table setting number 1 is this is really more about today than tomorrow. Bit of table setting number 2 is this. What we are doing tonight is an exercise in description, not prescription. Another way of putting that point is that tonight we are living in the land of is, not the land of ought. Okay? In other words, I'm not trying to argue that these are the 10 forces that ought to be shaping the Catholic future. That would be a very interesting conversation to have, and I suspect there's probably more than one opinion about that in this room. However, that's not tonight's conversation. What I am instead trying to argue is that these are 10 forces which truly are shaping the Catholic future, regardless of what you or I might privately think about. Okay? With that table setting, let's get into the meat of it. First trend I want to discuss with you is what I call the rise of a world church, a world church. The picture on this slide was taken from Pope Benedict XVI's first trip to Africa in 2009. He recently made his second trip, and by recently I mean a week ago. I was there. The Holy Father went to Benin. But this comes from his trip to Cameroon and Angola 2 years ago. This is actually the last event on his itinerary in Cameroon. The Pope was greeted by a delegation of local indigenous persons, popularly known as pygmies. As you can see, they did a little dance for the Pope. And then after this dance was concluded, they presented him with a memento of his visit. And believe it or not, this memento was a giant sea turtle. Huge. Right? Now, being the enterprising Vatican reporter that I am, I immediately scuttled off to the Vatican spokesperson, a Jesuit priest by the name of Father Federico Lombardi, to ask him what was going to become of this sea turtle. And I was told that it was being airlifted to Rome. However, Father Lombardi declined to comment on the obvious follow-up question, which is, okay, once it gets to Rome, what's its future? Right? Is this going to be a pet roaming the Vatican gardens? Is this going to be an ingredient in a soup? What's going to become of this turtle? To this day, I can't tell you what happened to that sea turtle. What I can tell you is that this picture captures in a flash the dramatic demographic transitions that are underway in the global Catholic Church. The famous Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner once said that in the long run of history, the Second Vatican Council in the mid-1960s would be remembered as that moment when the Catholic Church became a self-consciously global family of faith. That is no longer tied primarily to its European and later North American heritage, but truly global. Now, Rahner was making a theological point. What I want to suggest is that the population numbers in Catholicism in the 20th century lend triumphant empirical confirmation to that theological argument. And that's what this slide is intended to show you. What it shows you is what happened to the global Catholic population in the 20th century. As you can see, in the year 1900, that is at the dawn of the 20th century, scarcely more than 100 years ago, there were 266 million Catholics in the world, of whom 200 million, that's the orange bar, lived in Europe and North America. Just 66 million everywhere else. They were mostly in Latin America. This, of course, was before the population explosion of the 20th century. 100 years later, you can see what happened. By the year 2000, the dawn of the 21st century, there were 1.1 billion Catholics in the world, of whom 720 million, that's the green bar, live in the southern hemisphere. Latin America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Oceania. 380 million in Europe and North America. Another way of making the point is that in 1900, 100 years ago, only 25% of the global Catholic population lived in the southern hemisphere. By the year 2000, it was 65.5%. That's two-thirds. And if we run the clock forward to mid-century, the projection is that by 2050, that share will be three-quarters. In other words, by the middle of this century, 3 out of every 4 Catholic men, women, and children alive will live in the global south. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the most profound, most sweeping, most dramatic transformation of Catholic demography in more than 2,000 years of history, and we are living through it right now. Now, there are 2 corollaries to that I'd like to unpack for American audiences. Okay? 1, I know it is sometimes easy for us to believe, by us and North Americans, and particularly depending on where you live in North America, I suspect Ohio is probably a good example of this. It is sometimes easy for us to believe that the dominant Catholic story of our time is decline, right? Things getting small. Because this is often what we see, right? We see our parishes clustering, our schools closing. We struggle to keep our hospitals afloat. We talk about a priest shortage. We struggle to hand the faith on to the next generation. And if those are the realities in your backyard, they are, of course, very true for you. But I am here to tell you, this is not the dominant global Catholic story of our time. Instead, the meta-narrative, the dominant Catholic story of our time, is phenomenal, astronomic, runaway growth. We are living through the greatest period of missionary expansion in the history of the Catholic Church. Take a place like sub-Saharan Africa. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Catholic population of sub-Saharan Africa was 1.9 million. 1.9. By the end of the 20th century, it was 139 million. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a growth rate of 6,708%. Put that in your pipe and smoke it, huh? I don't care what line of work you're in. If you've got an almost 7,000% growth rate, that ain't bad. Okay? So the dominant story of our time as Catholics is not contraction, it's not entropy, it's not decline. It is instead breakneck missionary expansion. Okay? Second point, let's do some basic math. As of today, November 29th, 2011, there are 1.2 billion baptized Catholics in the world. 1.2 billion. There are 65 million Catholics in the United States, which means American Catholics represent exactly 6% of the global Catholic population. Another way of saying that is that 94% of the Catholics on the planet, in important respects, are not like us. And by the way, if you ever wonder why the Pope is not thinking American thoughts when he gets out of bed in the morning, you know, this may have something to do with it, right? I mean, it's a much bigger and more complicated church out there. Bottom line is this. If it ever was adequate, and I emphasize again, if it ever was adequate to see the Catholic Church exclusively through the prism of American concerns, American experiences, and American priorities, it is certainly inadequate to do that in the 21st century. It simply does not cut it. It does not do justice to the global realities of the church in which we are living. Okay? Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, what you're thinking is, well, it's interesting to know where the population numbers are, but the real question is, what does all this mean, right? What does it mean for the way the Catholic Church is going to look and smell and feel and taste in the 21st century? Well, I'm going to try to give you an answer to that question, but before I do, I want to put a huge grain of salt on the table, because here's the deal, folks. Anytime somebody stands up on a stage like this and tries to sell you generalizations on a pool of 720 million people, you want to be a little cautious, huh? Because for any generalized statement I could make about Catholicism in the global south, there are literally millions, if not tens of millions of exceptions. But that said, I think I can defend the 4 points on this slide. And I'm not going to go into all of them just in the interest of time, but I'll pick out a couple. First, when it comes to faith and politics, I think we're going to find that our Catholic brothers and sisters in the global south, by our standards, come off as very conservative on matters of sexual morality, very liberal or progressive on most everything else, broader questions of public policy and social justice. Now, before I drill down on that, I do want to give you another caution, okay? And I'll try to do this quick, but I think it's important. This business of dividing humanity up into left and right, into liberals and conservatives, okay? This is our taxonomy. This is an artifact of Western culture. It doesn't occur naturally to people in other parts of the world. Okay? Quick story. I was in Uganda not long ago, and I was invited to give an address at Makerere University, which is kind of the elite university in Kampala, which is the national capital. And as part of the program, they had asked me to have dinner with a group of 20-something political science majors, like poli-sci majors, right? So in the course of the conversation, I said, so are you guys liberals or conservatives? And the answer was, well, you know, we've studied those terms in class, but we're not quite sure what you're looking for. I said, all right, well, let's try this. Do you believe in a strong central government, or do you believe that government governs best that governs least? And the answer was, well, we can kind of see the argument for each. I said, all right, this isn't working. Well, let's try something easier. Okay? George Bush, do you like him or not? And the answer was, well, you know, we did some good things for Africa. We're not so hot in the war. Anyway, we spent the next 15 minutes talking about what Americans mean by liberals and conservatives. And at the end of it, this one young guy, who is kind of the spokesperson for the group, looked at me and said, look, I think the only honest answer we can give you to your question whether we're liberals or conservatives, the only honest answer we can give you is that we're both. Okay? And he meant it. All right? So my point is, I'm imposing a set of categories on people that wouldn't necessarily recognize them, but because we know what they mean, I think at a kind of rough and ready level, they can help us get our minds around things. So, when it comes to the hot-button issues of culture wars, all right, things like abortion, gay rights and gay marriage, the traditional family, gender roles, that whole cocktail of very divisive, controversial issues, I think you're going to find a meat and potatoes social consensus in the global South, including in the Catholic Church of the South, that by our standards comes off as remarkably traditional or remarkably conservative. And if you want an example of how this plays out in a religious context, consider what's going on in the Anglican Communion today, the American branch of which is the Episcopal Church of the United States, PUSA. The Anglican Communion is on the brink of a historic schism between progressive churches in the North, particularly Canada and the United States, that are pressing ahead with the blessing of same-sex unions and the ordination of openly gay bishops. And all of that is being ferociously resisted by a traditionalist Anglican center of gravity that is overwhelmingly concentrated in Africa. And by the way, folks, if you want to know which way the winds are blowing, consider this. Of the 79 million Anglicans in the world today, 41 million of them now live in Africa. They're actually more practicing Anglicans, defined as Anglicans who attend religious services at least once a week, more practicing Anglicans in the nation of Nigeria alone than there are in Great Britain. Okay, the mothership of the Anglican community. So a very clear indication of which way things are trending, But when you change the subject from the culture wars to broader questions of public policy and social justice, things like the ethics of free market global capitalism, the justice of international trading relationships, war and peace, race relations, HIV/AIDS, the environment, that whole complicated set of questions. Once again, I think you are going to find a meat and potato social consensus in the Church of the South, at the top and the bottom, that by our standards comes off as remarkably liberal or remarkably progressive. Let me give you the soundbite version of the point. Since April 2003, beginning of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, I've probably interviewed 250 Catholic bishops from various parts of the global South, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. I have yet to find one, and I literally mean not one, who wouldn't say that that war violated the Church's traditional tests of a just war. Now, I know that's a debatable point. People will have different views. I'm just trying to describe a climate of opinion, So when it comes to faith and politics, as this new generation of Catholic leaders in the South sets the tone, I think what we're going to find is, to us, a very counterintuitive mix of very conservative positions on some questions, very liberal positions on others. Now, of course, another way of looking at that would be that in its own way, this kind of southern mix comes fairly close to what the late Cardinal Joseph Bernardino of Chicago once talked about as a consistent ethic of life, a seamless garment, trying to put the church's pro-life and its peace and justice teachings back together. But look, however you want to analyze it, I think that's the reality. All right? Second point I'll pick out is youth and optimism, because I think this is a defining trait of the church in the global south. Here are a couple of demographic factoids for you. Do you know that in the southern hemisphere today, 52% of the population of the southern hemisphere is under 14 years of age? Even more staggering, are you aware that 90%, that's 90% of the human population that is under 14 is in the southern hemisphere? In other words, the demographics of the South skew overwhelmingly young. Okay? And the Catholic Church reflects those realities. I will tell you from personal experience that when you go to the typical Catholic parish in sub-Saharan Africa, half the time you don't know if you're in a church or a daycare center. Okay? Because kids are literally hanging from the rafters. And we all know, in terms of human psychology, what that means, right? Youth suggests momentum. It suggests energy. It suggests dynamism. It suggests tomorrow. And I think the psychology of the leadership class of the Catholic Church in the South has been shaped by that. I would almost say they've been infected by it. There is a mounting conviction among Catholic leaders in Africa and in Latin America and in Asia that their historical moment to lead has come. They are convinced that in the 21st century, places like Buenos Aires and Manila and Abuja and Mumbai will be what Paris and Louvain and Milan were in the 15th and 16th centuries. That is, the primary centers of new theological imagination, new political vision, new pastoral leadership. Okay? What I'm trying to tell you is that there is a sense among that 94% of Catholics outside our range of immediate experience, there is a strong conviction that the 21st century belongs to them. Okay? All right. Now, if our first trend concerned the global south primarily, the second trend I want to talk about concerns more the global north, that is Europe and North America. And it's what I call the rise of evangelical Catholicism. And here I am obviously borrowing a term from our Protestant brothers and sisters and sort of translating it back into a Catholic context. So here's what I mean by it. First pillar of evangelical Catholicism is a strong revival of traditional Catholic identity. Those traditional markers of Catholic thought, Catholic speech, and Catholic practice that over the centuries have set us apart from the rest of the world and told us who we are. So at a very simple, visible level, I'm talking about things like priests wearing Roman collars. I'm talking about members of religious communities wearing the habit. I'm talking about Eucharistic adoration, Marian devotion. I mean, hence, obviously, the picture on the slide, which kind of wraps all that up at once. All of those things that, in a certain way, after the Second Vatican Council in the 60s sort of went out of fashion, but today are quite clearly staging a comeback. Okay? Second, I mean public proclamation, that is, a strong drive to evangelize culture. That, after all, is the essence of being evangelical. You don't hide your faith under a bushel basket, you shout it from the rooftops. And then third, faith as a matter of personal choice, rather than something you simply imbibe from homogeneous religious neighborhoods or schools or cultures or institutions. Now, in that sense, on this third point about faith being a matter of personal choice, evangelical Catholicism is nothing more than a natural and inevitable byproduct of secularization. Because this is precisely what secularization does. It erodes those traditional religious enclaves, right? I mean, some of you in this room may be old enough to remember what it felt like to grow up in a ghetto Catholic church in America, right? You remember what that was like? You know, you didn't need anybody to tell you what the liturgical season was because you knew it by walking down the street, right? You remember putting A, M, B, G in your homework and saying Hail Marys before you shot free throws, right? And you also know that is not the world we live in anymore. Okay? In this culture, if you are going to be a practicing member of a religious community, it has to be a personal choice because the culture is not simply going to shove you in that direction. Right? So as I say, in that sense, to some extent, the rise of evangelical Catholicism is as predictable as the rising of the sun. Okay? It's an absolutely classic, 100% foreseeable sociological response to a changing cultural situation. However, I also want to suggest that evangelical Catholicism is a carefully and consciously adopted strategy by the leadership class of the church these days to try to prevent the church from being seduced by and assimilated to the very secular milieu that we find in the West, in Europe and North America. Let me say that differently and hopefully more clearly. If you want to understand why decisions are being made the way they are in the Catholic Church these days, why decisions are being made the way they are in the Vatican, or at the level of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, or many individual dioceses around the country, if you want to understand the policy-setting apparatus of the Catholic Church today, this is by far the most important trend to get your mind around. And just so you don't think that's some kind of private journalistic hypothesis, let me prove the point. This is a quote from the #2 official in the Vatican power structure. It's the Italian Cardinal Secretary of State, a guy by the name of Tarcisio Bertone. Here, by the way, is a footnote. This is apropos of nothing, but I think it's interesting nevertheless. I've covered Benedict XVI for 6 years now, which means that I've covered 6 of his summer vacations. And every year, Benedict XVI typically goes up to the Italian Alps to take his vacation, one of these villages that's sort of up in the north on the border with Switzerland. And no matter what destination he goes to, no matter how chic or ultra-exclusive it is, the Salesians, which is Bertone's community, the Salesians always seem to have a chalet there that they make available to the Pope to take his vacation. So, here's my real estate tip for the night. Those of you in the room who have Salesian friends who know a son of Don Bosco, try to get in on their timeshare deals, because it really would be worth doing. But back to Bertone in evangelical Catholicism. In 2007, Cardinal Bertone was addressing a group of businessmen in Milan, and being no-nonsense businessmen, they got to the bottom line. They asked him, what is the main objective of the pontificate of Benedict XVI? And you can see his answer. To recover authentic Christian identity in the context of widespread secularism. So this is not my theory. It is the stated priority of the papacy of Benedict XVI. And it was also, I would suggest to you, a core concern of the papacy of John Paul II, which means this has been the engine driving the policy-setting train in the Catholic Church for at least the last 30 years. Okay. However, I also want to suggest to you that you're going to get evangelical Catholicism wrong if you think of it exclusively as a top-down trend. Because it isn't. It is also a very strong bottom-up force in Catholic life. And let me tell you where you can find it in its most pronounced form. Where you can find it today, in its most high-octane sort of vision, is a certain subset of the younger Catholic population today. Now look, I'm not talking about the broad mass of 20 and 30-something-year-old Catholics who, of course, are all over the map in terms of their values and attitudes to the church and all of that. But I'm talking about that inner core of most actively committed and most actively practicing young Catholics today. The kinds of young Catholics you can find at a World Youth Day. And in that cohort, there is an evangelical energy so thick you could cut it with a knife. Okay? And let's be clear. We are talking about the kind of young Catholic most likely to discern a vocation to the priesthood or religious life, most likely to enroll in a graduate program of theology, most likely to pursue a career in the church as a layperson in either a full or part-time capacity. In other words, we are talking about the leaders of tomorrow. Now, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, this impression that inner core of young Catholics today, including younger priests, younger seminarians, and so on, that they were more traditional or more conservative. 5 or 10 years ago, you could argue that was an anecdotal impression. No more. By now, it is an ironclad, abundantly documented, empirical certainty. You can take it to the bank. Now, there are a variety of different ways I could demonstrate that to you, but let me just pick one, almost random. This is data from a study of religious in the United States, that is, men and women members of religious communities in the United States, carried out a couple of years ago by the National Religious Vocations Conference. And what this study found is a dramatic contrast between what he called the Vatican II generation, that is older religious who came of age in the 70s and early 80s, and that is immediately after the Second Vatican Council, and what he called the millennial generation, that is religious born after 1982. Now, frankly, I think a better name for that second cohort would have been the John Paul II generation. Because just as Vatican II was the central ecclesial point of reference for the older generation, John Paul was the defining experience for this younger. But whatever you call them, the contrast is crystal clear. What they found is that younger religious today are far more likely to stress fidelity to the church as a value to them and to choose the community they join on the basis of its reputation for fidelity. They are far more likely to want to wear the habits, to stress traditional devotion, such as Eucharistic adoration and the Liturgy of the Hours. They are more attracted to traditional apostolates and ministries. And perhaps the most important thing, millennials, the younger religious, have a far more positive attitude towards authority, including authority in the church, than the older generation. They simply do not have the same chip on their shoulder about the Vatican or the bishops that the older generation still carries around. Now, you can think of that, you can make of that what you want, you can have whatever opinion about it you like, but as a descriptive insight into Catholic life today, it is undeniably true. So what I am suggesting to you is that what we have in the Catholic Church in the global north is a double whammy. Okay? This evangelical Catholic ethos is the top concern of the leadership level of the church, and it is also the defining trait of the new generation now coming on the scene. And what that means is that tension around Catholic identity is destined to be a defining reality in Catholic life for the rest of our lifetimes. There is simply no zone of Catholic life, no ministry, no apostolate, nowhere you can go run and hide to avoid hard questions about how do we know that what you're doing is really Catholic? How do you define your Catholic identity? How do you defend it? How do you broadcast it to the rest of the world? And folks, I'm here to tell you, if those questions have not yet arrived in your neck of the woods, go home tonight and make sure your tray table is in a full upright and locked position, because I promise you they're coming. Now, I could pick any sphere of Catholic life I wanted to at random to illustrate the point, but let's take the liturgy. I mean, this ferment around Catholic identity is why the Holy Father, Benedict XVI, in 2007, issued a document authorizing wider celebration of the old Latin Mass, because over the centuries, the so-called Tridentine Rite, because over the centuries, it has been such a classic crucible for forming a strong sense of distinctive Catholic identity. I mean, this is why, ladies and gentlemen, last Sunday, for those of you who went to your local parish for the Mass, when the celebrant said, "The Lord be with you," you no longer said, "and also with you." You said, say it with me, "and with your spirit." Because this is a more faithful translation of the Latin original, et cum spiritu tuo. My point is that if you try to see that in isolation, you're going to get it wrong. You have to see it as a small piece of a much vaster picture. And this vaster picture is the driving concern of the church these days to foster a robust, muscular, unapologetic sense of Catholic distinctiveness. What sets us apart from the rest of the world? Okay? If our trends so far, the two we've talked about, have been largely ad intra, that is, internal forces in Catholic life, before we finish, I want to touch upon at least one that is ad extra, that is sort of crashing in on us from the outside world, yet with massively important consequences for the church. So the one I'll pick is the Biotech Revolution. All of these flabbergasting new ways science and technology presents to us today to manipulate life, including human life, at its most primitive levels and at its earliest stages. Now, you really don't need me to explain the Biotech Revolution to you because, of course, it's the stuff that headlines every day. You see here a list of 9 sort of new biotech debates ranging from cloning to savior babies and GMOs and genetic profiles and all of that. I think if you add all this up, what it points to is a basic philosophical question we're going to be facing in the 21st century, which is, in an era in which human personality can be manipulated like a piece of software in front of a computer screen, in an era in which species membership is fungible, where DNA can be carried back and forth across species lines the way some of us cross county boundaries on our way to work, okay, in such an era, What are those bedrock principles of human dignity that is going to undergird the defense of the sacredness of human life? Now, I could pick any one of these issues at random to illustrate those debates to you, but let's pick the ninth, okay, chimeras. Okay? Only because it's kind of exotic and sexy and fun. This is a chimera from antiquity. Okay? It was a multiple-headed monster that was the scourge of sailors in the ancient world. And those of you who know your classics will know that this chimera was slain by Bellerophon riding astride the winged horse Pegasus. Okay? Obviously not what scientists today mean by a chimera. Okay? What scientists today mean by a chimera is an entity that carries more than one genetic signature, that is, more than one set of DNA. Now, on an extremely random basis, chimeras do occur in nature. There's about 0.05% of the human population that if you give them one DNA test on Tuesday, you get one result. You give them another test on Thursday, you'll get another result. Okay? However, what is far more common these days is that chimeras are being artificially generated in research farms and in laboratories. Let me give you an example. I don't know if any of you have recently been to the hospital and had a blood transfusion, but if you had, there's a better than even chance that some part of the blood that is now moving through your circulatory system at one stage was in a hog. Because what's happening is because of the shortage of human blood donors, embryonic hogs, which have a circulatory system that most closely mimics that of a human being, embryonic hogs are being injected with human blood proteins. They're allowed to manufacture those proteins as they grow to adulthood. They're slaughtered, the blood is extracted, purified, synthesized, and turned into a human blood additive. What that means is that right now there are about 50,000 hogs on the surface of the earth that are carrying human DNA. Now, you may think, well, that's not such an ethical conundrum. Well, let me give you another case. Okay? There is a scientist at Stanford University, a guy by the name of Irving Weissman, who a number of years ago carried out a research protocol in which he injected embryonic mice with a sufficient amount of human neurological material that when they grew to adulthood, roughly 1% of their adult brains were composed of human brain cells. I mean, to put that in layman's terms, he injected a tiny slice of a human brain into a mouse. Now, the point was he wanted to study the development of neurological disorders like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. You can't slice open adult human brains to do that. That was the point of the research. Now, you may think, all right, a mouse with 1% of a human brain, we can get our minds around that ethically. Well, riddle me this, Batman. Weissman's new research protocol, which he has not yet implemented, but which has been green-lighted by the Stanford Ethics Committee, is to inject embryonic mice with enough human neurological material that when they grow to adulthood, 100% of their adult brains will be composed of human brain cells. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if this is the chimera of yesterday, behold the chimera of tomorrow. Now, I ask you, from the point of view of Roman Catholic anthropology and bioethics, what is the moral status of a race of Stuart Littles? Now, granted, the architecture of a mouse's brain is such, these mice are not going to be doing the New York Times crossword puzzle, they're not going to be enrolling in your Western Civ classes, but nevertheless, given how central the brain is as a carrier of human personality and human identity, does the fact that these mice are going to have miniature human brains, does that somehow change their moral taxonomy? Does that make them more than merely animal, albeit still less than fully human? And if so, do they have new rights, and do we have new duties towards them? Please do not rush to throw up your hands to volunteer an answer, because I sure as hell don't have one. My point is that this is an example of the kind of mind-bending new ethical challenge we are going to be facing throughout the 21st century. Because let's face it, the old biotech debates, things like abortion, contraception, and homosexuality, yes, we're still divided by them, but in many ways we're very comfortable with those debates. They've been around for more than 2,000 years. The kind of thing I'm talking about hasn't even been around 2 decades. And unfortunately, there is no analog of Moore's Law in the realm of ethical wisdom. You all know Moore's Law? If there are any computing science majors here, you will know this. It's the claim that the computational capacity of computers will double every 24 months. Okay? Well, there is certainly no guarantee, by way of analogy, that our ethical wisdom is going to double every 24 months, and every reason to believe it is going to continue to lag behind the pace of scientific and technological change. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we need to be frightened by these technologies. I think in many ways they are rich with the potential to cure disease and liberate human personality and so on, but they also do pose clear ethical challenges, and increasingly faith communities, especially the Catholic Church, which has such a rich tradition of sophisticated moral reasoning, we are going to be pressed in the gap to try to supply, to overcome that deficit between what we can do and what we ought to do. Okay? Well, I'm going to skip over the last trend I had hoped to talk with you about, which was globalization. Great picture, a great story about this picture, by the way. This is John Paul II wearing Bono from U2, wearing his sunglasses. So when we get to Q&A, if you want to hear the story, it's a really good one. But we're going to skip over it and get to the final point so we can bring this plane in for a minute. I don't know about you, but I think all the trends we've discussed here tonight, and for that matter, the ones we didn't get to, I find them all tremendously exciting. I think they are rich with the potential to liberate creative new Catholic energy. But let's be honest with ourselves. There's also a shadow side to these trends. Because these are all complicated questions, and there's going to be more than one Catholic opinion about what the right way to respond to them is. So if we're not careful, the rise of these new trends is going to exacerbate the existing fault lines in the Church and leave us even more hopelessly divided among ourselves than we are at the present. And if we take a clear-eyed look around, I think we would have to say that in many ways the Catholic Church is already, and in a particular form in the United States, is already a house divided against itself. So my final thought here tonight is that in the 21st century, the core challenge is not so much any one of these individual trends. The preliminary challenge, the challenge, if you like, is that we're going to have to summon the will to emphasize those things that unite us more than those things that divide us. Because if we don't do that, we are not going to rise to the occasion of these challenges. We're going to be steamrolled by them. And if you will bear with me for 1 or 2 more minutes, I'm going to tell you a final story to drive that point home, and then I promise we'll be done. Okay, story is this. Some of you in this room already know that I grew up in rural western Kansas. Now, I don't know if anyone here has ever been to rural western Kansas, and to tell you the God's honest truth, I can think of no reason why you should have. But if you ever have been, you would know this is not exactly a thriving crossroads of the tourist industry. Okay? In fact, the only time where I grew up when we get significant numbers of out-of-town visitors is right now, the fall, because this is pheasant hunting season. Y'all know what a pheasant is, a little game bird, kind of like a turkey. And there's a certain kind of guy, and yes, they are almost always guys, that finds the idea of putting on combat fatigues and blasting shotguns in the sky over the course of a weekend to be a real hoot. Now, generally, they do this while consuming astronomical quantities of beer. So they're usually a much greater threat to one another than they are to the pheasant population. But nevertheless, they come. Just to give you a sense of the cultural milieu I'm trying to describe, my 97-year-old grandma lives in a little western Kansas hamlet called Hill City. Okay? It's my candidate for the worst place name in America, because there is no hill, and there sure as hell is no city. Okay? 500 people on a good day, right? There is one 11-room motel in Hill City, America. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm a guy who's traveled fairly far and wide. I mean, with John Paul II, I made 50 trips to 65 countries. I've covered almost all of Benedict XVI's foreign trips. I've traveled on my own. I mean, I have stayed in some pretty funky lodgings. I mean, sometimes if you want a real hotel horror story, ask me to tell you about the Sputnik Hotel in Lviv, Ukraine. I swear to God, it will make your toes curl. All right? So I stayed at some pretty weird places. But this one 11-room motel in Hill City, Kansas is the only place I have ever seen where there is a laminated sign in the bathroom that reads, "Please do not gut your birds in the sink." I kid you not. The first time I took my poor wife there, she said, "Is this some kind of weird sexual deal?" No, honey, this is face value stuff. Anyway, our story is set on one weekend during pheasant hunting season. There's an out-of-town guy. Let's call him a lawyer from New York, who has come out to Graham County, Kansas to try to bag himself a bird. And he's spent a long and frustrating weekend with no success. Now it's time to go home. But before he packs up, he decides to take one last shot. So he sees a pheasant moving across the skyline. He shoulders his shotgun. He fires. In miracle of miracles, he brings down the bird. And so now, flush with triumph, he sets across the field to pick up his trophy. But just as he gets to the spot where the pheasant is fallen, there's a barbed wire fence that is clearly labeled private property, keep out. Okay? But, he's invested way too much blood, toil, tears, and sweat, so he starts to climb the fence. And just as he does so, the Western Kansas farmer pulls up in his tractor and says, "Hey, buddy, what are you doing?" And the guy says, "Well, that's my pheasant. I'm going to pick it up." And the farmer says, "Oh, no, you're not. That bird landed on my property. It belongs to me." Now, the lawyer, of course, is hot, he's tired, he's in a hurry, so he just erupts. And he says, "Look, you don't understand. I am a senior partner in a top 10 law firm in New York. And if you don't let me have that bird, I'm going to sue you back to the Stone Age." Not understanding this is pretty much where the farmer already lives. It's okay, I grew up there, I can say this stuff. Anyway, the farmer looks at him and smiles and says, "Well, that may be how you do things where you come from. But around here, we got a little something called the free kick rule." Free kick rule, what's that? The farmer says, "Very simple. I kick you 3 times, then you kick me 3 times. We keep going. Eventually, whoever gives up loses the bird." So the lawyer thinks, well, it's probably less expensive than a lawsuit. Plus, this guy looks 900 years old. I can probably take him. So says, "All right, let's do it." They line up against one another. Farmer looks the lawyer in the eyes and says, "Are you ready?" Now, the farmer, you understand, is wearing these heavy, mud-clawed Western Kansas work boots, right? Lawyer says yes. The farmer gives him 1 shot in the shins. He screams in pain. Another shot in the belly. This time, his howls of agony can be heard at the Nebraska border. Gives him 1 last shot into the chin. The lawyer is seeing stars. He's barely conscious. But finally, with his last best ounce of effort, he drags himself to his feet. He dusts himself off. He puts this look of grim determination on his face. He stares the farmer dead in the eyes and he says, "All right, you old coot, now it's my turn." And the farmer looks at him and smiles and says, "No, it's all right, I give up. You can have the bird." This is how we roll Western Kansas style. Ladies and gentlemen, I would submit to you that too often our internal conversation in the Catholic Church reduces to a kind of ecclesiastical version of the 3 kick rule. That is, too often, on those rare occasions when Catholics have different temperaments and outlooks and theologies and ideologies, on those rare occasions these days where they rub shoulders, they are not actually interested too often in a patient search for understanding. What they are really interested in doing is scoring rhetorical cheap shots against people we perceive to be our theological and ideological enemies. Now, under any set of circumstances, that would be aesthetically repugnant. It would be ugly. And those of you who know your von Balthasar know there's a theological insight there. If something is distant from beauty, it is probably also distant from truth. And under any set of circumstances, it would be impossible to reconcile with the spirituality of community, the vision of the church as a community of communities, to which John Paul II and Benedict XVI have both repeatedly called us. But in this brave new world I'm trying to describe, of mind-boggling new challenges welling up from within the church and crashing in on us from the outside, in that world, this sterile, ideological, and tribal war of all against all is quite literally a death sentence. It is a prescription for missing the opportunities that these trends offer us. And so if I can leave you with one final thought here tonight, and this is really not so much a thought as it is a plea. Okay? I am begging you. This is what the Italians would call a fervorino. Okay? Go forth from this place here tonight and think of yourselves as the architects and the artisans of this new spirit of friendship across the party lines in the church, what I would call a place-at-the-table spirituality. A notion that all the different movements and forces and voices out there in the Catholic conversation, they all deserve a place at the table. None of them has the final answer to the problems we face. But we have to be determined to listen to one another and to view one another through a hermeneutic of charity, a lens of charity rather than a lens of suspicion. Our first instinct can no longer be to think what is wrong with what this person stands for, but rather what is right about it. What can we embrace and identify with? How can we do business together? That's a success strategy for the church in the 21st century. And I promise you this, if this place at the table spirituality is to take hold, We cannot sit around waiting for somebody to ride in on a white steed and do it for us. It is a work we have to do ourselves. So my plea, my heartfelt invitation to you here tonight is to go forth and help construct these spheres of friendship in the church. And as the guy who is your chronicler and your scribe, that is, the guy who gets paid to watch what you do and then scuttle off and write about it or talk about it on TV, I look forward to watching you rise to this challenge, which I have no doubt, none at all, that you will. Thank you and God bless you. All right, so we've now got some time for Q&A, and let me give you my normal preface for the Q&A session. One, you are obviously welcome to ask anything you like about the presentation you just heard. Pick it apart, put it back together again, whatever you want to do. But do not feel restricted to that. If there's some other question you've got that we were not able to talk about here tonight, for example, on the lofty sort of substantive plane, you want to talk about the Vatican's line towards Islam or its response to the sex abuse crisis. That's, we're open for business. On the less lofty, more prosaic plane, if you have some long-harbored Vatican curiosity, like you want to know, is it true that Benedict XVI prefers orange Fanta to red wine with his dinner? Yes, that is true. So if something like that is on your mind, we're good to go with it. I may not know the answer to your question, but ladies and gentlemen, I work in American television. Absolute ignorance has never been a bar to my talking about anything before, and I see no reason why you should be here tonight. Okay, now that's the table setting. The warning is this. I'm getting paid to be here for the next 20 minutes or so, whether you like to come up with questions or not. So if you don't have questions, I'm simply going to stand here and tell you more Pope jokes. Okay, and this is not a consummation devoutly to be wished. So what's on your mind? Yes, sir.
When you were in the beginning, you made a comment that the Catholics in the South in general are what you call conservative on sexual matters and liberal or progressive on social justice. But I was surprised that you didn't know that. This is really typical of the church. If you went back to 5:11 or 5:12, you'd find corresponding with what we call conservative on sexual matters, but coupled with very bitter critiques of capitalism in many cases. So
yes.
This is anything new. This is just the opposite.
Quite right. For those of you who perhaps didn't hear the question in the back, the gentleman is absolutely 100% correctly observing. What I describe as the political ethos of Catholicism in the South, that is, conservative in sexual morality, liberal in social justice, is hardly a novelty in Catholic thought. In fact, it has been, in some ways, the defining characteristic of papal social teaching all along. You're absolutely right. However, I'm a journalist, not a theologian. Okay? I'm paid not so much to look at what we teach, but what we do. And what I would tell you is that sociologically, okay, in terms of the sociological organization of the Catholic Church in the West, by that I mean Europe and North America, you would never know that Catholics regard a conservative position on sexual morality and a progressive position on social justice as some kind of organic unity. In fact, we have done a very good job of splitting the Church's pro-life and its peace and justice teachings into diametrically opposing camps. Sociologically, here's my observation. Pro-life Catholics move in their own worlds. Okay? They read their own blogs. They go to their own conferences. They have their own heroes. And, similarly, peace and justice Catholics are the same thing. They go to their own meetings. They have their own websites. They read their own journals. And the problem is not simply that they may disagree on one or two things. The problem is they have moved so far down separate paths, they have completely different senses about what's actually happening, what the real issues are. These are alien planets. Now, there are, of course, towering counterexamples, heroic efforts, the examples of people trying to bring these two worlds back into conversation with one another. But I will tell you that sociologically, that would be my observation of what the reality of Catholicism in the West, including Catholicism in the United States, actually is. Which is why, when Benedict XVI's social encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, came out in 2009, immediately, by the way, in just days before President Obama came over for his only visit with the Pope to date, and the Pope gave him a copy of Caritas in Veritate. The unique thing about the content of that encyclical is that it was the first systematic effort to present the Church's pro-life and its social justice teachings as an organic unit. That is, you can find papal encyclicals on the pro-life stuff, John Paul's Evangelium Vitae, or, Humanae Vitae. You can find papal social encyclicals on the economy and war and peace and so forth. The novelty about Caritas and Veritate is that it attempted to bring those two things together and to demonstrate that they rise and fall together, ultimately. That was the thrust of the argument. And which is why I said at Caritas and Veritate, it is not any kind of innovation in Catholic thought. What it is, however, is a full frontal assault on Catholic sociology. It's a sociological challenge, not an intellectual challenge. I mean, can we, at the grassroots, in terms of how we deploy our resources and organize our lives as Catholics, can we bring these two things together? I think that was what Caritas and Veritate was trying to achieve. I think it is an open question as to whether it will actually pull it off. My one bit of optimism would be that for Catholics in the global South, which means 2/3 of the Catholic population today and 3/4 by mid-century, the combination of these two things is not nearly as counterintuitive as it often seems to us. And so if I am hopeful about some recalibration of the sociology, it more has to do with this cresting southern wave than any internal developments in Catholicism in the West. Yes?
I'm actually really surprised about the topic of chimeras. What's your personal opinion on this?
My personal opinion on what?
On chimeras.
Okay, the question is, what is my personal opinion on chimeras? Well, first of all, I'm a journalist, so having personal opinions is above my pay grade. I can describe and analyze, but what you want to think about it is up to you. Further, I don't have the scientific literacy to address this question in any great level of detail. What I will tell you, I know that there are some very strongly pro-life Catholics who find the very idea of a chimera to be an abomination. And on the other side of the ledger, I know there are some very strongly pro-science, pro-scientific freedom Catholics who would say that any kind of restriction at all, such as the law that was passed in the UK in 2006, which banned animal-human hybrids, who would say that that is an abomination. And, it's a truncation of the relentless quest for the human intellect to push the envelope and explore new frontiers. Both of those, to me, strike me as ideologies, and I am sort of preternaturally allergic to ideology. Therefore, I tend to think that the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. I think that, for example, the example I gave you of the hogs carrying human DNA in order to manufacture blood proteins, I personally don't find that terribly ethically problematic. I think when you move to other kinds of research that does carry the risk, I think, of some trace elements of human personality crossing species boundaries, I get a little bit more suspicious. So I guess what I would say is my personal opinion is it's complicated and we need to think about it, and we can't assume that the right answer is doing nothing or doing everything. As a related point, I would say that on the Biotech Revolution, one of the real dangers we face, and I think this is one of the challenges the Catholic Church is perhaps best positioned to face, is that all of the decisions, the important ethical decisions that these new technologies pose, are going to be relegated to a kind of very small and elite high priesthood of people who have the requisite training both in science and in ethics. Because this is the real problem, right? Most of us, if we're asked for an opinion on something like genetic profiling, or save your babies, or whatever it is, for most of us, our threshold response is, I don't understand the scientific, dimension of this well enough to have to frame an intelligent opinion. And that's understandable, but it's also profoundly dangerous, because what it means is the vast majority of the human population is going to be effectively disenfranchised from decision-making on things that are going to have profound impact on all of our lives. I think what faith communities can do, and particularly the Catholic Church, because we have such a distinctive and unique moral tradition to draw on, I think what we can do is promote a kind of sense of stakeholder involvement in this conversation through well-crafted sermons, through adult faith groups, through small Christian communities, and on, that can step through these issues, at least at an elementary level, so that people feel armed to engage the conversation in an intelligent fashion. Because to me, if there's one thing history shows us, it is when a society faces profoundly important ethical choices, and it effectively ducks those choices and assigns responsibility to them to some narrow cast of self-appointed experts, that way madness lies. Okay, this is a conversation in which all of us have to be involved, and I think the church can play a catalyzing role in promoting that conversation. Yes, sir, in the middle.
I would like to ask, how reasonable would it be to think that in the lifetime of anyone in this room, we can have a pope from Hong Kong, from Manila, from Sao Paulo, from Sub-Saharan Africa? Is that at all possible?
Well, thank you, sir, because I was worried I was going to go 10 minutes without the next Pope question. And we did finally arrive at it. I'm going to answer your question, but let me give you a caveat first. No one in this room, absolutely no one in this room, should take me seriously as a prognosticator of who the next Pope is going to be. And let me tell you why. In 1999, I published a biography of then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the last chapter of which contained 5 reasons why he would never be Pope. And here we are in the 6th year of his reign. A point that the Holy Father and his aides have found occasion more than once to remind me of, let me assure you. And so, in some ways, this is always a crutch. Okay? Second caveat before I answer your question is that I see absolutely no indication that any kind of transition in the papacy is imminent. Okay? Or to put it differently, there's just no indication of a health crisis around Benedict XVI at all. I mean, it is true that for the first time recently, and by recent I mean it was October 16th, for the first time, the Pope used that mobile platform, you remember from the John Paul years, to move up and down the St. Peter's Basilica. But folks, let's put this in context. Benedict XVI is an 84-year-old guy. And I've actually walked off the distance in St. Peter's, largest basilica in Christendom. I don't know if you've ever done this. But the ground you have to cover from the sacristy where the Pope vests to the back of the basilica, all the way down the central aisle, up and around to the central altar, okay? It's about 120 yards. Okay? And of course, he had to do that twice every liturgy, clad in heavy liturgical vestments. He had to cover basically 2.5 football fields every liturgy. I don't know about you, but if it were up to me, I would take the platform. Okay? I will tell you that I covered the twilight of the John Paul years. I know what it's like when the people around the Pope are worried about his health. And I get none of that vibe at all these days. On the contrary, the sense I get is that it's all systems go. I was with him in Benin. Okay? He was there 3 full days. The temperature was almost 100 every day. The humidity, I mean, it was like taking an outdoor shower every minute you were outside. Okay, I was ready to wilt. By the end of the trip, he was in much better shape than I was. Okay? Or to put this in soundbite fashion, ladies and gentlemen, as I like to say, German machinery is built to last. Now, having said those 2 things, let me come to your question. What is the possibility that in our lifetime we could see a Pope from the Global South, an African Pope, a Latin American Pope, an Asian Pope? I think, though, the odds are exceptionally good. I mean, look, in the last conclave, the conclave of April 2005 that elected Benedict XVI, effectively the runner-up was a Latin American, Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio from Argentina. Okay? And we know this isn't just spitting in the wind. I mean, I interviewed 2/3 of the cardinals, the 115 cardinals who cast votes in that conclave. Here's the striking thing. You probably know they take oaths of secrecy, right? But the striking thing is that every one of those 115 guys seems to have his own personal interpretation of what that oath of secrecy means. The one thing none of them will do is give you round-by-round vote totals. Okay, they won't tell you, well, in the second ballot, so-and-so had 78, and so, whatever. But other than that, most of them are quite willing to discuss the dynamics. Because, look, I mean, first of all, they know it's profoundly important for the church. And secondly, most of them realize it's probably the only time in their life they're ever going to get a chance to do this. And can you imagine, a situation in which the most exciting, most important, most consequential moment of your life had just occurred and you couldn't talk about it? Right? So I'm quite confident in saying that the second-place finisher, in effect, was Cardinal Bergoglio from Argentina. And so what that means, I think, is that in principle, of course, the next Pope could come from Latin America or Africa or Asia. Actually, I would go further than that. I would say that the conclave, the second conclave of 1978, the one that elected Cardinal Karol Wojtyła of Krakow as John Paul II, at the time, it was interpreted as having shattered the Italian monopoly on the papacy, right? First non-Italian Pope in 500 years. I think it did more than that. I think that second conclave of 1978 ended geography as a voting issue. Or to put it differently, it ushered us in a new era where the Pope could quite literally come from anywhere. let me ask you this, and I'm going to phrase this rhetorically, but I don't really mean it that way. Do you think Benedict XVI was elected because he was German? I will tell you for a fact, based on my conversations with cardinals, if anything, it was the opposite. He was elected in spite of being German. In the abstract, a lot of cardinals going into that conclave were attracted by the idea of electing a pope from the developing world. But here's the problem, okay, to come to the heart of the question. The problem is, you don't elect an abstract African or an abstract Latin American. You have to have a flesh and blood guy. You have to have a real candidate. And I will tell you that when the cardinals went into that conclave in April 2005, they looked around and they simply thought that Joseph Ratzinger was the most obvious pope in their bunch. He thought that he was the brightest bulb in the day. It didn't matter where he came from. It didn't matter how old he was. Okay? They thought he had the right stuff. So the question to ask there, is there a Latin American? Is there an African? Is there an Asian who similarly might strike two-thirds of the current crop of cardinals as having the right stuff to be pope, right? That's the question that matters. And I would say the answer to that question in each instance is yes. I think the leading Latin American candidate would be a guy by the name of Cardinal Leonardo Sandri, who is Argentinian. He's currently a Vatican official. His claim to fame was that he was John Paul's chief of staff. The technical Italian word is sostituto. But do you all watch The West Wing? Okay, Sandri was Leo to John Paul's Bartlett, if you get the analogy. Okay, he was the guy who made the trains run on time. Okay, and so Sandri's a guy who a lot of cardinals respect. I think right now in Rome, if you rounded up all of the well-informed Vatican watchers, okay, that is people who actually work in the Holy See, journalists who cover the Holy See, diplomats who represent their governments for the Holy See, got the best and brightest of the bunch, put them all in a room and said, give us the next pope. I suspect that Cardinal Sandri would be the top name they would come up with. Okay? Is there an African? I think there are two. There's Cardinal Robert Sada, who's from Guinea-Bissau, who is currently the head of Cor Unum, which is the umbrella, the Vatican's policy-setting arm for Catholic charities, who would be the more conservative, traditional African choice. And there's Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana, who is currently the president of the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, who would be more of a theological and political moderate. He's younger than Cyrus. He would also be the next generation of African leaders, much more cosmopolitan, worldly, and so on. Okay? And Turkson is certainly somebody that a lot of people would have their eyes on. An Asian, I don't know that there is currently an Asian cardinal, but the next time there's a consistory, which is the event in which the Pope creates new cardinals. Oh, and by the way, that is the official ecclesiastical terminology. The Pope creates a cardinal because it's a personal choice by the Pope. It's not an entitlement, which leads to the old Roman joke that only God and the Pope can make something of nothing. But anyway, the thinking at the moment is that there's going to be a consistory in February, okay, to make new cardinals. And the new Archbishop of Manila in the Philippines, a guy by the name of Luis Antonio Tagle, will become a cardinal for sure in that consistory, because the Archbishop of Manila always does. And I think anyone who knows the Catholic Church in Asia would tell you that Tagle is the dictionary definition of a rising star. He is maybe the leading theologian among the Asian bishops. He's actually a scripture scholar by training, but he has command of all the different disciplines. He's incredibly open, incredibly humble, simple guy. Before he was in Manila, he had a mid-sized diocese on the outskirts of Manila in the Philippines, where he was famous for having refused to take the limo and driver that the bishop had traditionally used, and he took the bus to work every day. Because he figured this was a rolling opportunity for people to have access to their bishop. And everybody knew that if you wanted to see the bishop, you got on the, whatever it was, the 41 bus at 8 o'clock in the morning, and Tagle would be there. And you could have access. He was also famous for just getting on his bike and going out to say Mass in poor, underserved parishes that didn't have a resident priest. Just the kind of guy he was. So, I mean, he combines incredible erudition, real political savvy, with also a genuine sort of spiritual, deep spiritual streak and real personal humility and a spirit of service. A lot of people are very impressed with Tagle. I could easily see him being a strong candidate. So, I mean, if your question is the next pope going to, I don't know, I mean, who knows, you know, but if the question is, are there credible candidates who many people in the College of Cardinals would take seriously as possible popes who come from the developing world? There, I think the answer is clearly yes. Anything could happen. Put it to you this way. I'm 47. I expect to see a pope from the developing world before I die. Other questions? Yes?
How do you see the role of women in the Southern focus?
Okay, the question is, how do I see the role of women? Yeah, the role of women in the Southern focus. Well, if you mean, is there at the moment a push for the ordination of women to the priesthood in the Catholic Church in the South? No. There's a real traditional sort of sense of gender roles. I mean, where we're going to be 100 years from, I don't know, but I will tell you for today, that there is no serious momentum around that issue that I can detect anywhere in the global South. There is, however, I think, a strong sense of the need to empower women in every way that doesn't require a Roman collar, okay? Both inside the church and in the outside world. I mean, actually, the Pope was just in Benin. One of the reasons he went there was to deliver the conclusions from a Synod of Bishops for Africa. That's a gathering in the Vatican where about 300 bishops from different parts of the Catholic world come to advise the Pope on something. And there was a Synod for Africa, which was composed mostly of the African bishops in 2009. And one of the sort of 4-star banner headlines from that document was the Catholic Church needs to be committed to the emancipation of women in Africa. And I think that push to empower women inside the church, again, in every way that doesn't question the teaching on sacramental ordination, okay? But that push to empower women, it comes out of a couple of things, okay? One is everyone knows that in many parts of the developing world, women are the primary carriers of the church's apostolic mission. I mean, to put it differently, if the women were to walk off the job, the church would come screeching to a halt. Okay, and it's a plain thing. Okay, but that's always been true. I think there's a more recent development that has crystallized leaders, and I'm talking about even what would strike us as some of the most conservative or traditional bishops in the church in the global South, who nevertheless have become really committed to this notion of female empowerment. And the driving force isn't some new theological insight. You want to know what it is? It's free market competition. Here's one of the big differences, okay, between the Catholic Church in the West and the Catholic Church in any other part of the world. In the West, particularly in Europe, but also in many parts of North America, when our bishops get out of bed in the morning, they're thinking about secularism. Right? That's the big threat they see on the horizon. Right? So it's a very kind of ideological defense that religion deserves a place at the table in a pluralistic society. Okay, that's what drives the train. That's what shapes their imagination. Do you know what bishops are thinking about when they get out of bed in sub-Saharan Africa? I will tell you, it sure as hell isn't secularism, because to be honest, outside very small pockets in the big urban areas, you have to look long and hard to find a real, honest-to-God secularist. Okay, if we define that as somebody who's sort of thrown in the towel on religious faith and practice, right? They don't exist. Okay? So the primary pastoral challenge perceived by the typical Catholic bishop in sub-Saharan Africa, depending on where he lives, it's either going to be Islam, or it's going to be newfangled forms of indigenous tribal religion, or it's going to be Christian Pentecostalism. Which, by the way, we didn't get to Pentecostalism here tonight, but it is one of my trends. It is by far, by some order of magnitude, the most rapid-growing religious movement on the planet. Okay? I know if you read the papers, particularly in the States and Europe, you would think Islam is conquering all. I will tell you that the growth rate of Pentecostalism globally is almost 100% more than the global growth rate of Islam. Christianity is actually outpacing Islam in terms of global growth, and it's almost entirely due to the enormous gains being posted by Christian Pentecostals. In Latin America, what does the typical bishop get out of bed thinking about? It for sure is not secularism, it is Pentecostalism. I mean, this is the religious story of Latin America in the last quarter century. Do you folks know that more people converted from Catholicism to Protestantism in Latin America in the 20th century than did so in Europe in the century following the Protestant Reformation? And almost all of that growth was in favor of the Pentecostals. The Latin American bishops in the 90s did a study which concluded that they were losing 8,000 people a day, every day, 7 days a week, 365 years, for a decade, 8,000 people a day to the Pentecostals. All right? Now, let me loop back to the question about women. Okay, why has this been a wake-up call for the Catholic bishops of the developing world? Because the primary missionaries and evangelists and apostles of the Pentecostal movement are women. I mean, many of these churches are founded by some charismatic male preacher, but if you drill down below that level, I mean, the people who are actually making the thing grow are women. That's true of the United States as well. Do you know who the first woman in the United States to own a radio station west of the Mississippi River was, for example? Amy Sample McPherson, founder of the Foursquare Gospel Pentecostal Church. Let me tell you a story that I think in microcosm is the religious story of Latin America. I was in Honduras not long ago, and I met this woman who told me that she was the last Catholic in her family, that everyone else in her family had become Pentecostal. And this is one of the elite families. It's one of the so-called 500 families in Honduras that can trace their roots back to the conquistadores, right? And so obviously I wanted to know why. So I said, what happened? She said, well, here's the deal. A few years ago, the matriarch of our family, the woman who really held the thing together, she got cancer. Very daily mass goer, daily communicant. Okay, she got cancer and went to the Catholic hospital. And she was in that Catholic hospital for about 9 months before she actually died, maybe a year. And during that period of time, her local parish priest got by to see her exactly once. Okay. And by the way, it's not because parish priests in Latin America are lazy. Okay, that is not the story. I know that we in the United States bitch about a priest shortage. Do you know what the priest-to-Catholic ratio in the United States is? It's 1 to 1,300. We have one Catholic priest for every 1,300 baptized Catholics. Do you know what it is in Latin America? It's 1 to 7,800. Phenomenal. Infinitely worse. Okay? That's true of most of the Catholic world. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's 1 to 5,500. In Southeast Asia, it's 1 to 8,300, and on and on. But the point is, the typical, and I know a lot of parish priests in Latin America, the typical parish priest in Latin America is responsible for some mega-urban parish with 40,000 families or something like that. He's probably also responsible for 6 or 8 or 12 satellite communities out in the hills he can maybe get to once every 3 months. He's probably teaching a half load at the seminary, and he's also moderating about a dozen lay meetings. Okay, so it's not like these guys, it's not like this guy didn't want to visit this woman, he simply was stretched far too thin. Despite the fact that this was ostensibly a Catholic hospital, it had no resident chaplain for the same reason. Which means that for the year this woman, this very faithful Catholic, was suffering from cancer, the church was essentially invisible to her. Now, meanwhile, the ladies from the local Pentecostal church were in her hospital room every day. They were holding her hand when she got her chemo treatments. They were praying with her afterwards. They were grooming her. They were going back to her house to make sure that the lawn was mowed and the bills were paid and the kids weren't in gangs and the husband was staying off booze. And it's no real surprise that 4 or 5 months into that, this woman decided she felt more at home in that Pentecostal faith community than she did in the Catholic Church. And in fairly short order, everyone else in the family followed. Okay? And in microcosm, you multiply that by 1,000 times, by 10,000 times, that's the story of the religious transformation of Latin America in our lifetime. Huh? Guatemala, neighboring Guatemala, is now the first majority Protestant state in Latin America. A generation ago, it was 98% Catholic. Largest Pentecostal church in the Western Hemisphere is on the outskirts of Guatemala City. It's the Church of Christ the Universal King and Savior. It's one of these soccer stadium-style places that can accommodate about 15,000 people, and they fill it up 16 times every week. Services in Spanish, English, and a variety of tribal languages. And, by the way, in the inimitably entrepreneurial fashion of Pentecostalism, it also has corporate sponsorship. Do you know what the name of the street that takes you out to the church is? It's Burger King Drive. Okay, because the CEO of Burger King Guatemala is a deacon at the time. All right, anyway, my point is that the Catholic bishops of Latin America in particular, but also other parts of the world, parts of Asia, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, have watched the phenomenal growth rates of Pentecostalism. They have absorbed the lesson that that growth is driven almost entirely by female missionaries and apostles and evangelists and church people. And they have drawn the conclusion that if Catholicism is going to compete, and I hate to use this crass capitalist language, but you get the idea, right? That if Catholicism is going to hold its own, it has got to do a better job of mobilizing its own laity, and in particular its own women. And again, I'm not just spinning the wind. I mean, look at the document the Latin American bishops published the last time they met as a group in Aparecida, Brazil in 2007. By the way, the picture on your program tonight is of me covering the Pope's trip to Brazil in 2007. And I told someone here in the front row, it's actually my grandma's least favorite picture of me, because despite the fact that I have been a smoker for 20 years, she still refuses to believe it. But there's photographic confirmation of the point. Anyway, the document that the Latin American bishops came up with in Brazil in 2007, the top note was a call for a continental mobilization of laity and in particular women. And I don't think that's just a feature of the Southern Church either. I mean, look around at the United States. It is a fact that in the Catholic Church of the United States today, 25% of diocesan chancellors in the American Catholic Church, in the 195 diocesan jurisdictions in the United States, 25% of the diocesan chancellors, basically the CEO below the bishop, 25% are women. 48% of all senior diocesan personnel are women. 85% of lay ecclesial ministers are women. Why is that? Well, because I think it is that bishops in the United States, too, have drawn the conclusion that we have to do a better job of mobilizing our laity, and in particular mobilizing women. So, I think vis-a-vis the women's question in the church in the 21st century, it's a glass half full, glass half empty deal. If the question is there going to be any momentum on ordination, either to the priesthood or the diaconate? I think the answer, at least in any short-term future scenario I can envision, the answer to that is clearly no. And that's the result not only of the more conservative ethos on gender roles in the South, but also evangelical Catholicism and its defense of traditional Catholic identity. You put those two things together, I think it means that question isn't going anywhere. I think, however, if the question is the Church going to actively seek to promote women in every way that doesn't require holy orders, then I think that the answer to that question is clearly yes, and it's already happening. I think we may have time for one more. Yes, over here.
I really appreciated your challenge about spirituality and communion. In your experience, where do you see that happening, and how do you see it happening?
Well, look, I think the question is spirituality and communion, trying to emphasize the things that unite us more than divide us. Where do I see that happening? First of all, I will tell you that my experience of being on the lecture circuit and being in and out of a lot of different Catholic venues every year in the United States and abroad tells me that there is a constituency for this effort. I run into all kinds of Catholics, left, right, and center, who tell me that they are sick to death of the never-ending internal warfare in the church and they're looking for something else. Okay? So I think there is a sociological basis for it. And I think if you look around, you can find all kinds of very intriguing examples of people who are trying to get this off the ground. If you want me to tick off a couple. The Focolare movement, which is a global Catholic movement born in Italy, but it's now present in, I think, 174 countries. The core of its spirituality is the spirituality of unity. This was a movement that was born in the rubble of the Second World War and passionately committed to the notion of the unity of the human family, and therefore the unity of the church, because the church is supposed to be a sacrament of the unity of the human family. Right? I think they're doing some very intriguing stuff. I think the Salt and Light Media Network up in Canada, which is kind of like Canada's version of EWTN in the sense that it's a national Catholic cable and internet operation. But it's very different than EWTN in the sense that I think everyone can see, whether you like EWTN or not, it clearly has an obvious ideological profile, right? Whereas Salt and Light has succeeded and yet remain, I think it would be very hard to pin down whether you would call it liberal, conservative, moderate. I think what you would call it is open. That they really make a good faith effort to be open to all the voices in the Catholic conversation, and they make it interesting. Okay, so I mean, it's lively TV, it's good TV. It's hard-hitting, it's well-produced, it's provocative, and yet it's not divisive. I think of the Catholic Voices Project in the UK. The Pope went to the UK last year, and you may remember in advance, the predictions were all like disaster, right? This was supposed to be the toughest room Benedict played in. All right, because you have the fact the UK, Great Britain, is one of Europe's most secular societies. This was coming on the back of the intense sexual abuse crisis of 2010 all across Europe, right? And you have the fact that making fun of the Pope is like the most popular indoor sport in the UK. And we're talking about a country whose national identity was forged out of repudiating the Pope, right? And so there were guys in the UK, high-profile atheists who were proposing that when Benedict stepped off the papal plane, he ought to be arrested and thrown in jail. I mean, that was some of the prophecy of what was supposed to take place. And yet, in the end, the trip went remarkably well. I think everyone, from the Pope's most rabid enemies to his biggest fans, would say that, at least from a PR point of view, the trip was a triumph. Part of what made it work is this thing called the Catholic Voices Project. This is basically a couple of lay Catholics in the UK who, in advance of the Pope's trip, saw this media storm taking shape and realized, geez, we better do something about it. So what they did is they rounded up a bunch of 20 and 30-something-year-old lay Catholics, drawn from all walks of life and all points of view. So liberals, conservatives, all over the ideological map, from different parts of the country. They gave them a crash course in media literacy and in the hot-button issues that reporters were going to ask about the church. So condoms, the sex abuse crisis, women, all the stuff that, we in the media love to talk about. And sort of got them to game up a little bit, and then turned them loose. So they became the face and voice of the papal trip. They became the soundtrack. Every time a reporter, a TV outlet, a radio station, a newspaper, every time they needed some commentary on the trip or some insight, they would turn to one of these Catholic Voices young people. They were ubiquitous. And they were phenomenal, because what they did is they humanized the church. Okay? They just sounded so rational and so normal. Even if you might disagree with them on particular points, it was just impossible to dismiss them as loony or extremist. My proof is that I was covering the trip for CNN International. And so the last day of the trip to the UK, Benedict went to Birmingham to beatify Cardinal John Henry Newman. I couldn't go to Birmingham because I had to be on the CNN set in London. So I was watching the video feed on a TV set, commenting on it. So when the Pope got done with his homily, that's when CNN tuned out. We weren't going to carry the rest of the Mass, right? And so when that was done, the Mass was still going on, but CNN was no longer carrying it. And the producer suggested, why don't we go to the pub next door and just kind of celebrate the job well done? So we walked into this pub, typical, a London pub. And I sat down at the bar. There were a couple of guys sitting next to me with kind of classic, stereotypical Cockney guys, right? The English equivalent of rednecks. Okay? Not a religious bone in their body. They were there because the Man City soccer match was going to be on in an hour, and they were waiting for Papal Mass to end so they could catch the game. Anyway, the Sky News was on, and it still had the feed from the Mass, and they had a couple of these Catholic Voices kids, young people, talking about, what it meant to them to be religious in contemporary UK society and all that, and making it all seem really rational and positive. One of these guys turned to the other, listening to these Catholic Voices people talk, and he says, "Oi, maybe they're not so bleeding crazy after all." I thought that was a win for the home team, right? And here's the interesting thing about the Catholic Voices Project. You know who the two founders were? The founders were the English director of Opus Dei in the UK and the managing editor of The Tablet, which is the most left-wing of the Catholic publication anyway. You would think in terms of church politics in the UK, this is matter and yet I matter. But the beautiful thing about it is these guys have been friends for years. And they knew that they coming together to sponsor this thing would give it life and would give it legs. It would make it credible in all the different constituencies. And it's actually survived the trip. There is now a Catholic Voices Academy in the UK. One is opening up in Australia. They hope to bring one here to the States to kind of do the same thing on an ongoing basis, to equip young Catholics to talk intelligently about their faith in the public sphere. And not to give one spin, not just to represent one Catholic tribe, but to do justice to all the voices in the church. So I think there are great examples of it out there. Now, the question you might ask, however, is if all that's true, why hasn't Catholic culture, in a more noticeable, palpable, massive way, why hasn't it changed? Why don't we sense this? And I would phrase the question this way. Look, what was the highest profile attempt in the Catholic Church in the United States to do what I'm talking about in recent experience? It was quite obviously the Common Ground project of the late Cardinal Joseph Bernardino Chicago. That was his explicit aim, was to try to bring the different voices together and try to overcome our internal divisions. And look, let me tell you, I love the Common Ground people. I've delivered the Common Ground lecture. I've supported it over the years. But I think if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we would have to say that 15 years after it was launched, we're more divided than it began. Measured against what it hoped to do, Common Ground failed. Why? Well, I'm not sure I have a comprehensive answer, but I'll tell you my hunch. My hunch is that it was a program ahead of spirituality. Here's what I mean. I would use an analogy to alcohol and drug addiction, right? We all know that 12-step programs don't work for people who don't want the help, right? You've got to have this bottoming out experience, this moment of clarity, before any formal program is going to do you any good. Well, similarly, I will tell you from my own experience, dialogue programs do not work for people who are not really interested in talking to each other. I mean, I will tell you, from the early Common Ground experience, what they would do is they would find the most far-out leftist and the most, troglodyte, knuckle-dragging conservative and throw them in a room and lock the door and hope by some kind of magical alchemical process, something good would happen. And usually they came out much more divided than they went in, What I would suggest is that as Catholics in the United States, we have to have that moment of clarity. We have to have that bottoming out experience where we realize the sterility of constantly being at one another's throats. In other words, we need a kind of, a metanoia, a conversion experience. We need to be in a different place before formal programs are going to do us any good, which is why when I talk about what we need to do, you will notice very carefully, I do not suggest that what we need is to launch a program or a movement or a structure. I think that's an ex post facto exercise. Okay, my soundbite is that what we need to do is build zones of friendship across the tribal lines. Zones of friendship across the tribal lines. Informal, grassroots, non-structured. Because here's the thing. We first have to become friends with one another before any discussion of substantive issues is going to do us any good. And by the way, to accomplish that, we need to understand we're bucking a powerful cultural tide in the United States. Here's a fact, and I draw this from a book called The Big Sort by a guy by the name of Bill Bishop, great book on American sociology. Bill compared two elections in the United States, the 1968 election and the 2004 election. Very similar in that the Republican won a narrow victory. Both were fought out on the terrain of values, right? In 1968, it was law and order Richard Nixon versus the hippie-loving, tree-hugging Hubert Humphrey. And in 2004, it was faith and values versus George Bush versus the effete, secular, East Coast intellectual John Kerry, right? Here is the payoff bit of data from the exit polls. In 1968, 75% of Humphrey voters said they had a close personal friend who voted for Nixon. In 2004, only 35% of Kerry voters said they had a close personal friend who voted for Bush. Now notice the difference. It's not that we were more divided in 2004 than 1968. No, we were equally divided then. The difference is, in the intervening period of time, we have become strangers to one another. And it is obviously much easier to demonize a stranger than a friend. We live in a society of gated communities, of the real and virtual sort. Okay? Now, you would like to believe that it would not be thus in the church, but ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that far too often it is. I will tell you from personal experience, I can parachute into any diocese in the United States and find a Catholic in the know, and in 5 minutes that person can tell me where the tradi parishes are, and where the Vatican II parishes are, and where the Peace and Justice parishes are, and the potato parishes, etc., etc., etc. We've got gated communities in the church. We Catholics like to compliment ourselves on being evangelizers of culture. But I would suggest that in this respect, the problem of tribalization, we have been thoroughly evangelized by our culture. We have drunk deeply at the well of secular acrimony and division, and we have reproduced it with exacting fidelity inside the church. So if we're going to overcome that, it has got to be a consciously countercultural exercise. And I will tell you, it cannot begin with debating issues. It has to begin with rebuilding friendships. And on that note, let me say one last thing and then we'll be done. If I mean what I say about the need to build zones of friendship in the church, then I obviously have to walk my own talk. So let me say this before we leave. I want this to be the beginning of a conversation among us and not the end. Okay? So if I can ever be of help to anyone in this room, I have no earthly idea what that might mean. But, if you're in a class and you think I might be able to suggest a resource, or you're in a small Christian community and you think you might want to bounce something off of me. I mean, for God's sakes, folks. If you're coming to Rome and you want restaurant recommendations, this is where I really shine. Whatever it would be. I have an online column that is called All Things Catholic. If you just Google or whatever, All Things Catholic John Allen, it will come up. My email address is at the bottom, and you are always welcome to get in touch with me that way. Now, please put like Ohio Dominican in the subject line, so I don't think you're the 8th Nigerian prince today who's got $30 million and wants to give me in by just giving my credit card number, right? But as long as I know you're legit, if I can ever be of any help to you, I would be delighted to do that. And here's the thing. It would not be an imposition. Okay? I'm out here preaching building zones of friendship. So if you give me a chance to be your friend, you would be giving me the opportunity to feel like a person of integrity rather than a fraud. Okay? So take advantage of that. Thank you. God bless you. God bless Ohio Dominican University.